So this afternoon it is a pleasure to welcome Hugh Rollinson, known to many of us, I hope, because he's our course director here at the Faraday Institute. Hugh is Emeritus Professor of Earth Sciences from the University of Derby. He graduated originally from Oxford, did his PhD in Leicester and postdoctoral work in Leeds. He then worked in the University of Gloucestershire for some years and has been around the world. At various times I noted he's worked in Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe and Oman, and eventually ended up as Professor of Earth Sciences and Head of Department in the University of Derby. He's a Fellow of the Geological Society, a Chartered Geologist and a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. And as I say, he's Course Director here of the Faraday Institute. His academic interests are in the earliest part of Earth's history. And by early, I think that means the first 2 billion years of planetary evolution. And he's going to talk to us today on the earliest life on Earth. Hugh.
Well, thank you, Keith, for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. And as you've heard, trying to understand how our planet works in its earliest stages is a real scientific challenge. And one of those challenges is about how life might have emerged on Earth. So I want to tell you about a project that I've been involved in over the years in thinking about the earliest life on Earth. So as we look at this subject, what I'm going to do is give you a very, very brief whistle-stop tour through the history of life on Earth to get to the problem of trying to identify the very earliest life on Earth. And what I want to try and show you in this talk is how it takes some time for scientific data, scientific ideas to be firmly accepted. Then to quickly look at when life might have started on Earth and how life might have started on Earth, with a final pause to reflect on these observations and to see what meaning they may have in a theological sense, particularly in a Christian theological sense. So this is our time scale that we are dealing with. We're dealing with a time frame from now back to 4.5 billion years. And so if we look at the first the last 500 million years of Earth history, we find them crowded with life following an event at 540 million years ago, the beginning of the Cambrian and the explosion of life onto our planet. And after that, huge diversity of life. But before that, there is evidence of life, but it's massively fragmentary. So we get to a point at 3.5 billion years ago now, where we have reasonably robust evidence for life on Earth. And then we go back to 3.7 billion, and that's the time frame I want to talk about, where we have probable life on Earth, and I think I shall show you that it's possible and very likely. If we think about the atmosphere, the Earth's atmosphere during this history is divided into before and after 2.35 billion years ago. In the more recent times, we've had the build-up of an oxygenic atmosphere, but before that, we had an Earth with a carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere. So, a brief history of life on Earth, and this is the time scale that I'm going to use. Along the left-hand side of this graph, we have the geological era, going down in time from the present back to about 700 million years. And so a whistle-stop tour takes us first to the cradle of mankind near Pretoria in South Africa, where we have there fossilized hominid remains from about 3 million years ago. We go back into the Cenozoic and we find many areas where there are strata containing marine fossils. We go back into the Cretaceous and the Jurassic, the end of the Mesozoic, and we find evidence of fossil birds, some of which have been reconstructed, and back to the era of the dinosaurs at the beginning of the Mesozoic. This is a site we used to take our students to in Derby, a site in southern France where they're excavating dinosaurs from Cretaceous rocks, and as you can see, it's become something of a tourist site, and there is a really excellent dinosaur museum there as well. Then we go further back in time to the era of the early reptiles and fish, and then back into an era when the first insects appeared and the first plant life is recorded. And then we go back to the beginning of the Cambrian, the fossils known as trilobites, which many people have seen and are well known in fossil displays and so on. And then we have the period of time we call the Cambrian explosion, and just before the Cambrian explosion there is still evidence of a lot of life on Earth, but it's soft-bodied life. So we have creatures like this, these fauna known as the Ediacaran fauna, taken from the locality in Australia where they were first discovered. But interestingly, in the UK we have some really excellent examples of these fossils in Charnwood Forest in Leicestershire. And also we have evidences of fossil life where the creature has left a trace in the sedimentary record but no hard parts, and so these are probably trilobite tracks. And then we go back in time into the Precambrian where the record of life is more fragmentary, and so we have things like this from about 750 million years ago where we've got colonies of single-celled organisms, amoeba-like organisms. And I've chopped the scale off here, but now you can see we're on the micron scale. So we're dealing with things that are microscopic in size. And then we go back to about 1,000 million years, and we've got these strange life-like looking creatures called acritarchs, which are, if you like, conglomerations of single-celled organisms. So that's really the record of life that we have it on Earth. And then we go from about 1,000 million years back to 3.5 or 3,500 million years when evidence for life on Earth is pretty fragmentary. But at 3.5 billion years, we do have some indications of life. This is a locality in Western Australia where there are some very ancient rocks preserved, where we have what we call stromatolites. Stromatolites are fossilized algal colonies, and what happens is these single-celled organisms form mats of algae which trap mud, and they're very fine scale, these mats, and it's the mud that preserves the record of the fossil life. And these things build up towards the light, they're in shallow water, and so they create these structures, these dome-like structures such as we see here. Now we also, and here's a better example actually, a younger example, but you can see the layers which build up these stromatolitic structures. Then we have evidence from South Africa as well of rocks of a similar age where there seems to be evidence of early life. There's an area called Barberton where there's some very ancient rocks in central South Africa where we have things such as these single-celled fossils, probably fossil cyanobacteria, preserved from about 3.4 billion years ago in what's otherwise a silicious-rich sediment. And in this area known as the Huguenot Formation in Barberton, we've got these carbonaceous mats, which are thought again to be algal mats, which have been preserved in sediments from these very ancient times. And in both places, Barberton and in the Pilbara area of Australia, these rocks tend to be very well preserved, and so we can expect to see evidence of early life in these rocks if it were there. So what we see in this record then is a huge expanse of time, 3 billion years, when very little seemed to be happening in terms of the fossil record. Life was present on Earth, but you really have to search hard to find it. So if we're going to look for the earliest life on Earth, we need to go somewhere quite exotic, and I'm going to take you now to a place in West Greenland called Isua, where some of the Earth's oldest rocks are recorded. And if we see the capital of Isua on the west coast of Greenland, the town of Nuuk, and then we travel about 150 kilometers inland to the edge of the inland ice. This is where the localities are found. It's a very exciting place to work because the only way to get there is by helicopter, and it's quite a rough place to work. And we, when I was part of this project, took advantage of an old mining camp which had been abandoned, and we pitched our tents around it. So it's a wild place, and geologically the rocks form a horseshoe-shaped unit of mostly volcanic rocks. The units themselves are about 1 or 2 kilometers wide, and the whole structure is 20 or 30 kilometers across, to give that map a scale. The rocks that we find there in the lower picture are mostly volcanic in origin, but there are some sedimentary rocks shown in the upper picture as well. These are mostly what we call chemical sediments, and the way I tend to think about these rocks in their origin is probably some huge volcanic island, maybe like a modern Hawaii. So most of the rocks are lavas and basaltic in origin, and there are a few sedimentary rocks which are intimately derived from the lavas. Now, I've just put this picture in to remind me to tell you, this is a picture of the mineral garnet seen down the microscope in rocks from Isua, to remind me to tell you that these rocks have been seriously cooked. These rocks, not just because of their great age, but because of their geological history, have been down to about 20 kilometers in terms of their burial, and they've been cooked up to about 600 to 650 degrees centigrade. So searching for life in these rocks is not a trivial enterprise. Even if we can find any biological material, it will have recrystallized to a form of carbon, it will have recrystallized to graphite. And my contribution to the work that I'm talking about from Isua was actually to do these calculations to work out how hot and how deep these rocks had got as a kind of precursor to thinking about early life in these rocks. So back in 1979, there was a chemical signal detected in these rocks which suggested that there may be a fingerprint of early life. 20 years went by, and technology in that time had improved incredibly, and then there came a landmark Nature paper by Stephen Mogis, who was at, I think, UCLA at the time, who wrote this paper about finding a record of early life in these rocks. And what he did was he took these tiny, tiny grains of a phosphatic mineral known as apatite and noted that in them they had these tiny carbon globules. And again, you can see we've got a scale on here. We're dealing at the microscopic and submicroscopic scale. And what he was able to do with new technology was to zap these carbon particles with an ion beam and obtain a chemical signal from them, something that had never been tried before. And so we were in a new era in terms of understanding the likely origins of these carbon particles. And it was in the late 90s when, following this work, I was invited to be part of a team which went back to look at these rocks in a huge amount of depth in order to see if we could substantiate these findings. The trouble is, if you've got carbon in a rock and you want to make a claim that it's biological in origin, then you need to subject your thinking to some fairly serious scrutiny. For instance, is the carbon the same age as the rock that you're looking at, or has it somehow been introduced into the rock at a later time? Is the type of rock that you're looking at plausible as a geological context for life? And interestingly, the carbon had been found in a phosphatic mineral. Well, of course, phosphorus is always part of living organisms, or it is today. And so geochemically, at any rate, the connection was very plausible, and that was part of their argument. But then there's a further question. Is the carbon itself biological in origin, or could it have come from some other non-biological source? So these were the materials that were the subject of scrutiny. But first, it's necessary just to sidestep into a little bit of science for a moment to explain the criteria that we use to identify carbon of a biological origin. We use the fact that carbon is commonly made up of two separate isotopes. This means that carbon always behaves chemically as carbon, but there are light and heavy, low mass and high mass versions of carbon, which we identify as two different isotopes. We're looking at the difference between the amount of carbon-12 and the amount of carbon-13. And what we find is that we can measure these things using these abundances using mass spectrometry, and we've got a fancier way of measuring the data. They're measured relative to a standard in deviations from the standard in terms of parts per thousand. So we use this delta carbon-13 notation. But what we find is that in the natural world, living organisms tend to prefer the carbon-12 version rather than the carbon-13 version. So it's possible to identify a geochemical fingerprint of life in the form of carbon that we're looking at. Most natural processes have a value of around 0 on this scale. Biological processes tend to have values -20, -30, -40 on this delta carbon-13 scale. So Stephen Murgis had looked at these apatite grains, and he'd looked at the carbon, and he'd found some quite negative carbon isotope signals in his carbon grains, values of around -30. The question was, is this a real biological signal? And if it is this biological signal as old as the rocks which are hosting the apatite, 3.7 billion years? And a further study, sadly, in many ways, showed that Stephen Murgis was wrong, that a closer scrutiny of apatite grains in this suite of rocks showed two populations of apatite grains. Apatite itself can be directly dated because it does contain some traces of radioactive elements within it. And it was possible to show that there was a population of apatite grains which were truly old and formed at the same time as the rocks in question, but they were devoid of carbon particles. And there was a younger population of apatite grains which had all these carbon particles in them. And then a fairly elegant theory was constructed to explain how the carbon had got into the apatite grains. I should perhaps add, and this helps elucidate the young carbon, that I mentioned these rocks have been quite seriously cooked. My own studies suggest that these rocks have actually been cooked many times, probably 3 times. And so they've been crystallized and then recrystallized and then crystallized again at different times through their history. And it's quite likely it's one of those later events which led to the introduction of carbon into these grains that would claim to be the first evidence of life on Earth. So the first attempt to show life on Earth at 3.7 billion years failed because the carbon was shown to be not as old as the rocks which host it. However, at a similar point in time, in 1999, a scientist called Minnick Rosing, who works in Copenhagen, and Minnick, interestingly, is one of the very few Greenlanders who's become a well-known scientist, reported from a different outcrop but the same region, a suite of rocks which really do look like bedded sediments. And microscopically, these bedded sediments do appear to have particles of carbon in their structure. And so we seem to have 3.7 billion year old sediments with carbon particles which show a chemical signal of life. These grains were measured in a similar way to the ones I've described, and they have a light carbon isotope signature, about -20, not that strong, but it is there. However, there is another problem, because it has been asked, can we mimic the biological carbon isotope signal with natural processes? And so in 2006, Thomas McCullum showed that in the laboratory you can create a light carbon isotope signal in carbonaceous materials through non-biological processes. So that was a bit of a blow for those of us who were hoping that we really had found the earliest evidence of life on Earth. These are his data, and this graph then on the left-hand side shows you the carbon isotope scale going from 0, where many natural processes take place, down to -60. And you can see on the right of this scale a range of biochemical reactions in which the carbon isotopes are fractionated to very low values. And on the left you can see values that are from the geological record but not from ISOA itself. And experimental work, you can see from the triangle in the lower part of the diagram, is able to replicate the signal that we find in biological materials and better the signal that we find in some geological materials. And this is the most recent data from the outcrop that I just showed you from a Japanese group working in 2014, who show that there is a negative carbon isotope signal down to about -22 or -23. So we can mimic the signal biologically, but does that mean we actually have done? However, the story continues, because in 2016 a group of scientists went back to ISOA, and what they found was, because of increased ice melting, they discovered outcrops that they had never ever seen before. So Alan Nutman and Clark Friend, who've been working in Greenland for at least 20 years, report a new outcrop that they'd never seen. And in that outcrop, they report the findings that they have got fossil life actually preserved in the form of these stromatolites, these algal mats, usually preserved in a carbonate rock. And these are pictures from their paper showing these curvy structures which they believe are biological in origin. Sadly, this work was also dashed just this last year. A group in Australia have shown that these things are not true stromatolites. They're not truly biological in origin. They are the product of the fact that these rocks have been very strongly deformed. And so what we're seeing in these curved structures is folding, not biological activity growing in shallow water upwards towards the light. So where are we at? Well, we still have this evidence from these carbon globules in the sedimentary rocks, which I think give us the best likelihood of life on Earth. I think the argument for making graphite carbon negative in a non-biological way needs a little bit of further work, because the work that has been done is largely done on carbon-bearing gases. That's where the fractionation is reported in the laboratory. And if we think about the amount of carbon-bearing gas that would have had to have gone through these rocks in order to leave the volume of carbon that is found, then I think we may have a volume problem in actually generating the amount of carbon that we actually see. The most recent study on these rocks looked not just at the carbon isotope signal, but looked at the morphology of these graphite grains and argued that the morphology of these grains looks biological and is not the same as non-biological graphite. And further, the crystallinity of the graphite that has been observed is reported to be similar to that of the rock in which it crystallized. In other words, it belongs to the rock. This hasn't been introduced later. The host rock is the genuine home of this carbon. So for me, we do have, I think, permissible evidence of life on Earth at 3.7 billion years. But as you can see, it's been a bit of a roller coaster of a story in order to get us there. So if we take this further and ask, when did life on Earth actually start? I've got a condensed timescale here now. I'm just looking at the very early part of Earth history. So we've got the origin of the Earth at the point 4.567 billion years, a nice easy number to remember. 4,567 billion years. And this was the point at which our planet formed through the process of accretion. And as far as we can tell, this is a process that happened pretty rapidly, of the order of up to 10 million years, which in the grand scheme of things, when we're talking an age of the universe of 13.8 billion, is a relatively short period of time. Then we have the moon, which formed through some cataclysmic explosion when a Mars-like body impacted the Earth about 4.45 billion years ago. There was a huge explosion, the Earth melted, and the moon formed as a consequence of this event. And then we have the oldest preserved Earth materials, which again come from Western Australia, and are just tiny individual crystals, a few microns to a few millimeters in size. So from about between 4.4 and 4.3 billion years, we actually have materials that are that old. Then we have the oldest rocks, which sit in this time frame. And then we have the oldest life definite and the oldest life probable, and then life continuing thereafter. Now, an event which is highly relevant to our understanding of the origin of life is an event which happened, and working out its timing is a bit tricky, but anywhere between 4.2 to about 3.9 billion years, which we call the late heavy bombardment. This is a period of time when we know the moon underwent a series of huge meteorite impacts and asteroid impacts. And we can see that happened on the moon because the craters are still there and they can be put into some sort of chronology. And we know that this was a severe event. And if it happened to the moon, then the Earth being larger, it must have also happened to the Earth. So we know that very early on in the history of the Earth, it was the most terrible place, a hellish place, if you like. And geologists tend to call this early period of time the Hadean, which many people link to the idea of hell, but it actually means hidden. It's the hidden era of geological understanding because it's something we know so little about. But modelling suggests that when the Earth was at this stage, and here are 4 snapshots that you can just about see from 4.4 to 3.5 billion years ago. And what they're showing us is the effect of impacting on the Earth and what would happen as asteroids and huge meteorites hit the Earth. They would trigger a melting event inside the Earth. And so there would be huge volcanic eruptions associated with this impact cratering that was going on the Earth. So we can see that at this very early stage, the Earth was a very inhospitable place. It has been argued that between these events, and since they're geographically restricted, life could have been present on the planet, but it would not be having a very happy time. This is a picture showing the depth of impacting that's taking place during these events, and we can see in the early stages we're going down to almost 20 kilometres and so on, so quite deep impacting as well. So we've got this interval then when we've got this period of late heavy bombardment, and then we've got the interval when we think we've got the oldest life on Earth. And what we've got then is a relatively narrow time interval for life to emerge on Earth. Now, if we look at this in a slightly broader context, so we've got this early period on the planet when it would have been completely inhospitable to life. But if we think about this in a grander timescale now, and I'm calling this the process of creation ordering, if you like, here's our timescale and our narrow interval for life on Earth. When we turn to our cosmologist colleagues, we realize that before our planet ever came into existence, there was a long, and they tell us necessary, time interval to produce the materials, basically the raw materials, the elements that we need to create carbon-based life on Earth. So our planet had a long and necessary prehistory of the order of 9.3 billion years, if we're taking a 13.8 billion year age for the universe. And then after 3.5 billion years, we've got 3 more billion years of evolution before we have the Cambrian explosion and life comes on Earth in abundance. And then we've got this narrow interval in which we think life might have emerged. So if we look at this in a slightly different way, we've got this long, long prehistory, and then we've got an event when our planet formed pretty rapidly by cosmological timescales. And Mars is similarly thought now to have had a very rapid period of formation. And we have another event. We have the origin of the moon. And you could argue we have another event when life appears rapidly on the planet. And then, of course, at 540 million years, we've got another event in terms of the Cambrian explosion of life. And so what we seem to be seeing is a process of ordering of creation, which is a very slow and protracted event, but then it is punctuated by a whole series of rapid fire things. So if you like, and I know the biologists used to think about this years ago, and I don't think they do anymore, but long periods of apparent stasis and then significant events. How did life start on Earth? Just a quick word about this, because this is a huge subject in its own right. I'm going to bring us right up to date in terms of what geologists are thinking about as the most plausible origin for life on Earth. But if we look at the necessary preconditions, the first crust that we would have had on Earth would have been basaltic, because that would have been the after effects of the lunar creation. So the impacting, the melting, the formation of the moon, and the Earth would have been left with a thick basaltic crust, probably 50 or so kilometers thick. It would be undergoing a lot of impacting and volcanic resurfacing, and deep craters would have been formed on the surface of the Earth. And there is pretty good evidence that we had water on the surface of the Earth, certainly by 4.3 billion years. So our planet cooled down pretty quickly. And this in itself is a whole and interesting story, which is a separate one, and that is that, of course, at this time the sun was faint, it wasn't as powerful as it is now, so strictly our planet should have been an icy planet, but it wasn't. It had liquid water on it, and there's a whole story there, which we won't go into. So the model I want to suggest is the current prevalent model amongst geologists for the origin of life is what we call the Serpentinite model. And this has been pushed quite hard by a chap called Mike Russell, who was at Glasgow and is now in Houston, I think he is. And he has argued that we need to use the information that we get from highly magnesian rocks, that's what serpentinites are, which get altered by warm water at modest temperatures, 200 to 300 degrees centigrade. And this probably means that the rocks we're talking about are the rocks of the Earth's mantle, deep rocks actually, not surface rocks. And so these are rocks which have a very high magnesium content and will then readily convert to this mineral serpentine through this hydrolysis. And there's a place in the Atlantic today, on the mid-Atlantic ridge, called the Lost City, where there seems to be evidence of this process actually happening today. Now, interestingly, Keith mentioned that some years ago I lived and worked in Oman. In Oman, we have a modern-day analogue of this process, because in Oman we have mantle rocks at the surface. You can't see them on my photograph, but they're the brown rocks at the top of the photo. And interestingly, we have springs in Oman which have a curious chemistry. They've got a skin of carbonate on them. They're blue in colour, and if you watch them, you see bubbles of hydrogen and methane coming out of these springs. They're highly alkaline springs, and so the serpentinite model requires highly alkaline solutions, maybe associated with carbonates, in which very simple hydrocarbon molecules can be synthesized. And it's been shown that this can happen in the natural world without any previous biological input, that we can make simple hydrocarbon molecules, and methane is the most complicated thing that's been made so far. So we've got a long way to go to get to life. And what this does, I think, is bring together a number of previous theories of the origin of life, because people have talked about the way in which clay minerals can be used to help catalyze the process of the origin of life, or some of those chemical processes. And serpentinization is creating a clay mineral in its process. It's using hydrothermal fluids, which people have talked about before, and so it's bringing together the best of these things. But what it does is it says this chemistry is happening in an alkaline environment. The early ocean would have been highly acidic because of the carbon dioxide atmosphere. So we've got a chemical gradient which can energetically drive some of the processes that we need in order to generate some of these more complex molecules. And it also is a very nutrient, in the sense of metallic, nutrient-rich environment in which these processes can take place. Now, the serpentinite model, to me, requires that we use highly magnesian rocks. Now, the surface of the Earth would not have had them exposed. Basalt, even in the early Earth, isn't very magnesian. It has perhaps 15% magnesium oxide in its most primitive form. Mantle rocks have about 40% magnesium oxide, which is where I think the serpentinization would take place. So what I'm arguing is that we had to have had cratering to dig through the basaltic surface of the Earth in order to expose some of the early mantle rocks, which would then need to be hydrated. So this cratering process in the early stages of Earth history, if you like, is a necessary precursor if our serpentinite model is to take off. Then we need our oceanic water, which I've mentioned is going to be acidic, and then we have a reaction between the water and the shallow interior of the Earth, the top few tens of kilometers, to get us hydrocarbons. The other thing about these vents is that not only are they a place where life could have been formed, but they are a place that would nurture life as well, and also nurture the biochemistry of life as more complex molecules were formed. So, to finish with just a few, what I'm rather grandly calling theological reflections on what I've been talking to you about. First, I want to take us back to what I'm calling this business of creation ordering. Carbon-based life on Earth was a long time coming. There was the pre-solar preparation. There was the long terrestrial gestation, because it really, until it was 1 billion years before we really got anything on Earth, and it was another 3 billion before we got anything that looked like what we would recognize in life. And so here's a theme that we find in the Bible. We find the theme of waiting to God to act. Sometimes some of the stories that we read about in the Bible, there is a long period of waiting before something happens. And then there's the idea that this long period of nothingness is punctuated with specific events, if I can persuade you that that's real. And then the question is, does it mean anything? Does it have anything to say in Christian theology in terms of making something out of these events which have happened in our planetary and even cosmic history? We know they happen in Jewish and Christian history. That also is punctuated by events with long periods of stasis. So maybe there's something there. this is a seminar, so I can ask you questions just as much as you can ask me questions. So there's a question from me. The other point to make is that on our planet, as we think about the origin of life, I see an interconnectedness of what's going on in our planet. That in order to generate life, we're not just looking at the rocks. We're looking at the rocks interacting with the hydrosphere. And maybe with the atmosphere, if we need to include the carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere to give us a carbonic ocean. And so there is this sense, which we often forget about, that we live in a world in which all creation is praising God. And therefore it's part of Jewish and Christian thinking. And so whether we need to make something more of the interconnectedness of our planet. I'm not wanting to go down a Gaia route here. I'm wanting to stay orthodoxly Christian. But nevertheless, there seems to be in this story something about interconnectedness. The other thing to pause and think about in this story of the origin of life is our significance. An old quote now by Jacques Monod, but in his famous book, Chance and Necessity, he writes, "The emergence of humankind is the result of chance. This is the principal result of science and also the most unacceptable." When we look at ourselves from the earth, we see ourselves in a very lonely universe. And so we are asking ourselves, what is our significance? Our small space which we occupy in this vast cosmic landscape. And you can argue the same thing from time as well. That in terms of the vast time of the universe, here we are, as it were, at the end of days, populating this world for just a few million years, if we take our hominid ancestry. And so what point do we have in being here? And you could argue that by themselves, these data suggest that our presence in the universe means nothing. And this is where I would want to turn to Christian revelation and say that this is why the Christian scriptures are so important, because they tell us something different. They tell us that we are significant in what is otherwise a vast and what can be apparently a meaningless universe. And the other question which we'll continue to grapple with, and for which I have no simple answer, is the question of uniqueness. Is what happened on Earth, those simple processes of chemistry, geochemistry, biochemistry, is this just typical of a rocky planet formed in the habitable zone of a star like our sun? Could this be replicated in many places elsewhere? We now know that there is organic matter preserved on Mars. Whether that will ever tell us there's life on Mars, we don't yet know. So how special is the Earth relative to the other rocky planets? And I'm beginning to think there may be a case for saying that our planet is, in some way, special. Maybe, to use the words of the cosmologists, finely tuned. But I think that's a subject for much more exploration and debate. But of course, we've got a talk coming up on the 14th of February, where we're going to be listening to Professor David Wilkinson from Durham talk about exoplanets, aliens and God. And so we can park this particular question for a week or so. And his lecture is on the 14th of February at 6 o'clock at Queen's. So, to pull this all together, I would argue there was definitely life on Earth at 3.5 billion years ago, and most probably also life on Earth at 3.7. And life probably started shortly before 3.7 billion years, when the meteorite impacting event had begun to quieten down. I would suggest, according to our current knowledge, that life started in warm alkaline springs associated with this process of serpentinization of the Earth's ancient crust. And as we pause and ponder theologically, there are things to think about in terms of the timing of our creation ordering, the interconnectedness of our Earth system, and our place in this planet and in this universe. If you want to read something technical, I wrote a book about the early Earth some years ago, and there is a chapter in that on the origin of life. And more recently, I've been blogging courtesy of Ruth's blog using the Science and Belief blog, and you can find a few things that I've written more recently about these self-same issues. So I'm grateful for your attention.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you very much. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. 10 minutes is a very short time compared with 5 billion years on the frontier.
Thank you. That really helps us to see it more clearly. But why do you think the Bible says that it was created in days? Why didn't the Bible say eras?
We of course, have got the benefit of modern geological dating, which really only has happened since the 1950s. And even if you go back a couple of centuries, people hadn't really thought in geological timescales. So we're talking about a pre-scientific era in which people used a different language to express themselves. So without getting deeply into it, I would just say that the writer of the book of Genesis was not using scientific language. They were telling what I believe is a really important story, but they were telling it in a different way from the one I've told it today in my talk.
Let's take one here and then the other side. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. What do you regard as the transition between organic matter and life? How's that defined? Is there a definition?
Well, I think for me, and I probably need to defer to my biologist colleagues, it's the point at which things can become self-replicating, because then we've got a process which is, if you like, sustainable. The other thing that I think we should look at is when things get packed inside a membrane and we've got the formation of a single cell. In my thinking, although a single cell seems very simple, they're not. And if you've made a single cell, then you're on the whole road to the rest of biological evolution. So sticking a membrane around a series of rather complicated things is another step in this whole process. But self-replication, I would say, is the first part of the story.
Thank you.
Just across there.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. You talk about the great long periods of time, and then very, very short periods of time, the Cambrian explosion, and then, of course, human life.
Yeah.
And it tends to give us the sense of great long periods of time, and then us a very, very short time, and then the end. But, of course, we're only halfway through, aren't we? So instead of thinking of us as the end, if we think of ourselves as the start, does that all, I mean, we could evolve into any sorts of life. I mean, carbon, silicon, I don't know what, but I mean, doesn't that alter the way of our time frame and our events and all the story you've been talking about?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It's wrong of me to imply that we are at the end of time. We're at the end of time as we know it, but of course our star has got a few more billion years to burn, and so there's quite a lot of future potentially there. And so quite where we go next in terms of evolution, I think I'm going to have to defer to other people. I'll stick with the early bit.
Yes, thank you. You cited evidence for life potentially at 3.7 billion years ago, 3.5 billion years ago, and at times since. Is there evidence or belief that life continued through all that time, or could it have come and then conditions been so inhospitable that there wasn't life for whatever, 500 million years, and then it started again?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that is possible, but what I would want to try and explain is that we have when we're looking at the fossil record, we have a problem of preservability. The chances of a creature dying and being preserved in the geological record are very slight. The right conditions have to be met. And when we're just talking about single cells, which are so fragile, you need a very special environment in which to preserve them, not least a very, very fine-grained material that is able to bear the imprint of that material and conditions in which it's buried and preserved. So I would put the long gap down to a question of preservability. That in my thinking, once life got going, I think it continued. The record is fragmentary because it's not been well preserved. And it may also be that we've not looked hard enough. You know, there may be rocks at 2 billion years which have evidence of life in them, and we've just not really looked very hard.
Yes, thank you. Oh, sorry, nearly lost my thread there. You mentioned our hominid ancestors.
Yeah.
The early chapters of Genesis describe God creating people, man and woman. He called them Adam and Eve. If they're a product of evolution, they must have had parents. And so my question is, why does the genealogy start there and not with their parents or predecessors?
Yeah, okay. Again, I think I go back to what I said a moment ago, that the person who was writing that account was writing with a worldview of the time when it was written, whenever it was written. They were writing to a particular audience, and it was, if you like, a pre-scientific era. And so I'd say they were writing a story for a particular purpose, and the purpose was not to explain what we would like to know, is where did Adam and Eve's parents come from? I mean, for us, perhaps that's a modern question that didn't occur to the writer, because he was trying to tell a different story. So I hope I'm not dodging your question totally, but I'm saying it's a different sort of writing for a different era.
And I'm sure the founding director of the Faraday Institute wouldn't excuse me if I didn't use that as a plug for a book which I'm sure is on the bookstore by Dennis Alexander, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? And I saw Dennis's hand going up, so maybe you might like to say something. Ruth, Dennis is just next to you there.
Well, thanks for the plug very much. I appreciate that. Okay. Actually, I was going to ask another question, a different one entirely. So my question was, you had mentioned, the possibility of life coming from other planets, and of course that's an active discussion still, because of the very short time span geologically in which complex life, if stromatolites, whatever, if they're single-celled organisms, I mean that's, as you said, very complicated, and so one would imagine that would take a long time. So what is your own view? I remember an experiment where somebody put some bacteria, and this is on this planet Earth, they put some bacteria in a rock and blasted it at a huge speed at a brick wall, just to see what would survive, a sort of fun experiment. And, there's some of the bacteria, whatever, did survive pretty well. I just wonder what your own view was about sort of life from other planets, that sort of explanation for the origin of life.
Yes, well, you're right. There is, in the meteorite record, there is evidence of quite complex organic molecules, amino acids, in some meteorites which have clearly come from space. In my view, and I guess I'm going by what the community is thinking at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a lot of support for this extraterrestrial origin of life. Now, I can begin to guess why, and I think it's, again, to do with the fact that when these things enter the atmosphere of our planet, are they going to survive? So let's imagine the Murchison meteorite back in 3.8 billion years arriving on Earth. It's got to arrive in a very nurturing environment in order for those amino acids to be subsequently converted into more complex molecules and so on. So I prefer a model which is homegrown rather than one which is from space. Clearly there's stuff going on in space which creates complex organic chemistry, but whether or not this is where life came from, I prefer to think not. I tend to think of it in terms of natural processes on Earth.
One last question over the far side there.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the carbon-12 isotope. Firstly, why is it that organisms seem to prefer that isotope, and is it feasible that perhaps early life may have preferred a different isotope?
Well, to answer the second part first, yes, I guess it would be. But we've tended to use that as a signal. Actually, it's perhaps not quite correct to say it's early life that it's life that preserves the reaction. It's a chemical pathway which life uses to do some of the stuff it does, which actually prefers the light isotope rather than 13. Now, there may be a deep biochemical reason why that happens, in which case the chairman can probably answer that question.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
But what we tend to do as geochemists is something that's a little bit simpler. We're kind of fingerprinting, really. We're looking for signals in the record that tell us what processes might have been and what organisms might have been. So that's the way we work, generally.
Great, thank you. I think the time has come to draw things to a conclusion. Thank you, Hugh, so much for informing us in a very entertaining way this afternoon. Thank you very much.